Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Will Pomeranz. I'm Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute, and I would like to welcome everyone back to our first event of the 2021-2022 season. It's going to be an exciting year at the Kennan Institute, and we hope that you can continue to follow us and follow developments and review our analysis on Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. I also encourage you to stay up to date with the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our two blogs, The Russia File and Focused Ukraine, as well as our podcasts, Kennan X and The Russia File. Well, I'm so pleased today to welcome Regina Smyth for a book talk on her latest book, Elections, Protests, and Authoritarian Regime Stability, Russia 2008 to 2020. I'm holding it up here, but I don't know if there's actually anyone can see it, but it's there. I've read it, and I encourage everyone to buy it and read it as possible when you get a chance. Regina is the professor of political science at Indiana University. She has written extensively on post-Soviet political developments in the Russian Federation, focusing on elections, political parties, civic initiatives, grassroots mobilization, and the effects of social policy. She has won all the major awards that one can do, including from the Smith-Richardson Foundation and the National Council for Eurasian and East European Research. Her articles have appeared widely in regional studies and disciplinary magazines. And I was so pleased that we could join forces last year and publish an issue of, co-edited issue of Russian Politics, exploring the new constitution, or the new amendments to the constitution. You can find her new book on Amazon and the Cambridge University Press website. And Regina is also a recent alum of our Wilson Center's program. If you have questions for the speaker, you can send them by email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, to our Twitter account at Kennan Institute, or right on our Facebook page. Please be sure to include your name and affiliation when submitting your question. We will not be able to include your questions if you do not include the name and affiliation. With that, we're going to turn to Regina for a 5-minute introduction about her book, and then we're going to have a conversation between Regina and myself, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So Regina, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Will, and thanks to Wilson and Kennan for having me last year. It seemed like a really good idea to do this book talk when we scheduled it so many months ago, right at the contemporaneously with elections. It seemed a little less or a little more stressful last week, but I think it's a really interesting time to have the conversation. So the book came out of my history of being in Russia during elections, where I was there for every election between 1993 and 2011-12 in some capacity. And the language around each election was that every election in Russia was the most important pivotal election for the time. So each election brought significant changes to the Kremlin strategy to secure a victory, but also they produced outcomes that had lasting impact on Russia's political development. And we can think all the way back to the watershed elections that saved Yeltsin in 95 or brought Putin to power in 99, the 2008 election that defined the tandem, but also these more subtle but important changes like taming the systemic opposition parties through elections, the use of elections to solidify united Russia in 2003, 2004, and of course the 2011-12 protests. So the question for me after 2011-12 was, do elections or will elections still matter in these important ways after they're increasingly controlled by the presidential administration? And as I was sitting in my apartment in Moscow in 2011, in December, I looked out the window of our lovely apartment to see riot police cordoning off Pushkin Square in anticipation of protest. This was even prior to the election. This was a couple of weeks prior. And it raised a really important second question for me about the relationship between elections and protest. Not only these post-election protests so well described by Mark Beisinger and Val Bunsen, Sharon Wolchik, and others, but the effect of local, regional, issue-based, and grassroots mobilization that I was seeing all over Moscow's neighborhoods. So the question there was, does a rise in civic activism say something about social change and the conduct of elections or the challenge of elections? And this question was at the center of political science. Sidney Tarrow, the great Sid Tarrow, and Doug McAdam had just published a paper calling for more research into the link between elections and protests. So my approach to these questions varied from how political scientists usually look at this, and took opposition very seriously. So, and even this under-institutionalized, weak, nominally unpopular opposition to better understand its influence from election to election. So in my work, the theory posits that elections aren't a game or a strategic interaction between the regime and voters, but between the regime and the opposition to gain voter support. And the currency under this type of electoral management system is not votes, but the information yielded by the strategies of the state and opposition, and how that new information, what I call actionable information, might change attitudes and actions going forward. Being in Russia in 2011-12 meant that I could organize a team of students who conducted surveys in both the pro-Putin rallies, the anti-Putin protests, and then a national sample of the city of Moscow to be able to compare across these different groups about when and why people protest and what might be the legacy of these kinds of protests in terms of individual change in political engagement. So the book brings together data on electoral voting, protests, narratives of change between elections to show how these things are linked. And I think just conclude with the three big takeaways. The first is that each election is distinct and pushes the regime towards or away from openness. And this has implications for the next round of contests. So there is a legacy both of the strategies employed in each election and the individual responses to those strategies. The second takeaway is that authoritarian elections are now permanent contests between the opposition and the regime, a permanent state of elections where they're interacting continuously during and between elections in response to new strategies, changes in support, external shocks, in order to shape what comes next in the way that will best suit their own purposes. So here we can think about things that are already very familiar to us: constraining party registration, building new Kremlin-sponsored parties, understanding local preferences and the role of constantly polling in the regions to understand social preferences, how activists are recruited, and how media ecologies, online and offline, are being shaped by both the regime and the opposition. And the clear effect, the last takeaway is the clear effect of protest mobilization, even these small grassroots regional mobilizations, on electoral contestation and vice versa. So it's now a symbiotic sort of system of civic activism that's deepening both civil society and the social capacity to self-organize. So this doesn't only mean voting strategies or voting or not, but who becomes an activist, how organizations are built and relate to other organizations in the region, particularly on regional and local levels. And this is something we often miss in our focus on national elections and governance in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but it's going on all around Russia. So that's sort of the context that I brought to trying to understand this election, which I think sets a good table for talking about what happened.
Thanks so much, Regina. And so I will ask the first question, a series of questions, and I will ask, what actionable information did you learn yesterday?
So I think we all knew what the outcome would be. The outcome was pre-announced. The Kremlin always fulfills its plan in one way or another. I think we learned two really important things as observers of the election. The first is the depth of the opposition, so voter opposition. So yes, there is a strong Putin core. That core is reflected in public opinion polls. It grows a little at elections because people look at the slate and say, if not Putin, then who? And they may not like United Russia, but they join that. But that's about 35% of the vote among a really small and large and partially porous turnout. So what we learned was how hard it is for the Kremlin to manufacture, increasingly difficult for the Kremlin to manufacture the majorities it wants, given declining support. And I think we also learned, if we look at the regions and what's going on, that there's a lot of contestation out there that we're not paying attention to.
So picking up about the opposition and the depth of the opposition, to what extent, can we talk about the depth of the opposition when the opposition isn't able to mount a campaign? Because obviously there are tremendous resources that the Russian state puts into making sure that their opposition doesn't run, that we've had all these different types of laws dealing with foreign agents, extremism, undesirable organizations to limit the opposition. So to what extent, you talk about learning about the opposition, but to what extent did we learn about the opposition this go around?
So I was talking specifically about electoral opposition, not organized opposition, but let me shift gears. One of the takeaways of the book, and people often ask me why I have a formal model in the chapter and it's so tedious to read, but the formal model is one way to show that given the state's extreme control over the things you're talking about, who runs, who gets on the ballot, that the organized opposition has very few paths to influence election. They're enormously constrained. And that would be true regardless of laws on foreign agents or mass arrests of activists. So it's really, I think, a remarkable feat that any opposition can be expressed through elections, given the lack of organizational leadership and the challenges that they're facing with every election. And this election undoubtedly was the most repressive. I think it was Andrei Kolesnikov who really stated that beautifully by saying the regime is now inhuman or reaching inhuman levels of repression. It's certainly a larger level of repression than we've seen. And we also saw this shocking turn in the complicity of tech industries in stifling opposition. And I think that's also a huge development that should be front and center when we talk about what happened.
Yes, I want to pick up on that last point too. Isn't that the biggest victory for Putin in this election, that he was able to intimidate Western IT companies, Google and Apple, etc., so that they withdrew the apps for Navalny's opposition website?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut it.
No, I just if you could talk more about the the results of that type of in action.
Right. So it's hard to talk about that without talking about a smart vote strategy, right? So Navalny's smart vote strategy was a very clever political strategy of identifying for voters the candidate in many districts, not all, where there was a viable candidate who had the best chance of challenging United Russia. And it actually has two effects. So in districts where there's real viable opposition, it becomes a strategic voting mechanism, which guides voters to coordinate around someone who could actually win. And in places where there isn't really a viable opposition, it serves as an action of protest or protest vote. So the first thing is that if we're going to understand smart voting, we have to understand its dual function, not only its single function. Smart vote relies on communication through the internet to propagate these lists or send these lists around Russia. The regime had already been working very hard to limit the distribution of lists by his foreign agent law, identifying anyone as complicit or amplifying this information as in violation of the foreign agent law, or potentially being able to be charged with treason. The Insider had a wonderful piece on the attack on VPNs in Russia a couple of weeks before elections that could be used to spread this information. But the biggest attack, which came quite late in the elections and may or may not have changed the outcome all that much, the actual vote outcome all that much, was this decision to go after apps, Google apps and Apple apps that were smart vote apps that people could use to download the information. And that certainly is something entirely new and extraordinarily worrisome.
So from your perspective, in terms of going after these apps, in terms of going after opposition parties and so forth, is that a sign of weakness for Putin, or does this send him does it even send him a false message of security and stability, that somehow he can manipulate the system so that he always wins, even though his popularity is either stable or declining in other regions?
So it's a really good question, but I think it's kind of a false dichotomy. So I don't know what Putin learned from this. He certainly learned that he can win even under adverse conditions. I do think that there are limits to these strategies, and it's very hard to predict when we get to the limit, right? We've seen this in op-eds today. It's very difficult to see when the society decides it has enough, when the critical mass of people in society realize they have to take action, even when there is no viable, clear opposition, that the risk of the unknown is better than the certainty of this regime. So I don't know if that satisfies you. I will say that I do think two things have to happen. One is that the scholarly community needs a new way to talk about these authoritarian elections that really get at the heart of what the problem is, which is the state manipulation. And even calling them elections right now is extraordinarily uncomfortable. And the second thing is it really points to the need to clarify internet governance around elections so that we don't think we're hitting bright lines or needing to comply with Russian demands.
Our speaker is Regina Smyth, and if you have questions for your speaker, you can send them by email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, to our Twitter @Kennan Institute, or right on our Facebook page. So in the book, you kind of, and you've actually witnessed all the major elections since 1990, since the 1990s going forward. When did this electoral process go wrong? I mean, was Yeltsin responsible? Did he manipulate it enough so that he set the stage with all these political technologists and so forth? Or is this really a post-Yeltsin, Putin phenomenon?
So I think this actual election illustrates the answer to your question. This is not 2016, where the Kremlin was able to manufacture 70% support with 70% turnout. This is an election where there are wide variations in regional vote totals, where the communists win some elections, and where the electoral sultanates, the same regions that have been overproducing both turnout and support for the regime since the Yeltsin period are driving a good 6 to 7% of national level vote totals in the PR race. And this is how Putin's core support gets amplified. And Steve Fish wrote eloquently about that in 1995, and people sort of shrugged off and said, well, who can control what's happening in Chechnya or Ingushetia? But it turns out those results are really shaping the national outcome. Yeltsin also built Kremlin parties that were put in as spoilers or to siphon off vote, something that the Kremlin didn't use that much and now has gone back to using. So while the Kremlin has its own unique strategies, like packing each district with a specific number of candidates engineered to get a specific outcome, or this electronic voting situation, which seems just, again, another tremendous challenge to any opposition mobilization. The roots of this system are in the Yeltsin administration. Oh, I lost you.
So what did we learn about electronic voting in Russia in 2020 and 2021? Obviously, it appears that it can be easily manipulated. Is that the strategy going forward? That they have, multiple days of electronic voting, and all of a sudden, cities turn blue?
Yeah, that's what we learned.
That
is exactly what we learned. So, and we learned that when it was tested in the United Russia primaries, and it returned all the old stalwarts to run for office rather than some of the more exciting new candidates. And we also learned it in the report of the Moscow elections, in which we saw smart voting candidates getting a very different level of vote in the in-person vote and the electronic voting. Casa-Mursa said today on a different panel that if you look at those two election outcomes, it looks like two different countries. And I think that's exactly right, it does. And that's because electronic voting is largely coerced. So workplace mobilization was suggested to be carried out on electronic platforms. It's widely known that electronic platforms are not, your identity is not hidden, your identity is accessible, and your vote choice is knowable. And so it's not only a place where they can manipulate vote, it's highly coercive, so that the people who vote under that system are aware that they're being watched. The secret ballot is obliterated.
So the question that you raised about when do you get to the limit? When do you kind of see this potential, such a weakness that it could actually be some change, democratic change or regime change or whatever? And historically, it's when there was a combination of political, social, and economic crisis. Basically, one can dispute some of that, but in this economy that Putin now controls, there is an element of this predictability and stability, at least in the short term, that, the price of oil goes up, the price of oil goes down, gas goes up, gas goes down, but he has this basic economic stability and strength that allows him to paper over all these problems. So what was striking about this campaign was that there was no platform for Putin other than social spending. In other words, he could buy people off. So to what extent does this economy, Russian economy, so dependent on raw materials, oil and gas, but bringing that an element of stability, that it affords Putin the opportunity to kind of continue on this road?
So I'm going to disagree just a little, Will, that the meaning of stability that you're describing, this macroeconomic stability, is shifting. And it certainly is true for some people, Budjetniki, for example, people who are on the rolls Police and security forces seem very well compensated. There was a big effort to buy back the pensioners after the disastrous pension reform and the discussion about non-indexing pensions through the Constitution, something we addressed in the special issue. But on the whole, I think stability is now about personal, individual level stability in this very rough economy. And I think that part of that story is that people who are dependent on the state for their job are less and less capable of resisting state instructions about when and how and where to vote. And that's a really important development that we've seen in Hungary. It's been exacerbated by COVID, where support for cooperatives and small enterprises or lack of support for cooperatives and small enterprises changed the labor structure. And I think this is a really important element going forward. So stability, I think for most Russians now means making a go of it day to day in the face of household inflation and shaky job prospects.
Our speaker is Regina Smyth, and we're going to open up the floor for questions in a few minutes. But if you have questions, you can email them to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, to our Twitter @Kennan Institute, or right on our Facebook page. The demise of United Russia has been predicted many times, and yet obviously somehow it always pulls through. It's really quite remarkable. But obviously with various sorts of voter manipulation, they always somehow give the appearance of winning, even though their public standing is declining. So how long can Putin hold up United Russia as a kind of establishment party? And is that kind of the telling point or the turning point? If somehow he doesn't have such a party, is that the time when Putin's grip on the regime decreases?
So I've never been one to predict the demise of United Russia for this reason. It's become a huge mechanism to constrain, monitor, and sanction elites, both in the regions and in the center. So United Russia has failed to build linkages, any serious linkages to voters. And it has even, despite the rhetoric, failed as a party of patronage. So despite the enormous control over state resources, it's not actually building strong ties to voters by redistributing or serving the needs of their constituencies. In this election, you talked a little bit about the election campaign. There was almost no election campaign anywhere. But in this election, I did see a lot more linkage between United Russia and their constituency, threatening that if they didn't vote for United Russia, roads would not be built. And that only by voting for United Russia would roads be built. And I've even seen, Milonov, this terrible political hack in St. Petersburg, many of his constituents anecdotally were saying, okay, yes, we don't like him, he's a terrible human being, but he's built something, right? And what I think the next iteration of United Russia might be, because I think you're right, that Putin doesn't like change, right? He doesn't want to get rid of it. And because it serves this elite function, will be to double down on patronage and double down on redistribution and try to win support. And I think that might be the sort of next stage of development. Unfortunately, they have done not a very good job of that.
Was there, so we'll go to the questions next, but did anyone actually present a positive platform? I mean, obviously we're very used in the United States to negative campaigning, but did anyone put forward a positive vision of where Russia was going other than patriotism and social rights, etc.?
So I think there was very little national level platform being promoted in the Duma elections. And there was very little discussion in the gubernatorial elections, which sort of underscores that a lot of these governors are figureheads and the first deputies running the region, right, and signing the program. I think in the regional elections, and here's where we can talk about it, but the Central Election Commission's slow response and also manipulation of statistics makes it hard to give a full analysis right now. But in some of the regional elections, in Tomsk, in Rostov, there were, in Perm, there were very clear discussions of serving citywide constituencies, and even a lot of positive discussion about the success of smart voting in the past to not only bring politicians to the table, but to create an environment in which even representatives from United Russia on that level were working with them to provide some kind of representation. And this is most prevalent in Tomsk, in Novosibirsk, in Moscow, but it's a sort of model out there that that exists, and we'll have to see what happened in regional elections in the days going forward to see if that model can persist.
Okay, we're going to our questions. So our first question is from Caillou Lee, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And he wants to know more about protests and the organizations of protests at a local level. Are these where the protests are taking place? And how are these protests organized? And what issues brings people to the streets on a local level?
So the book sort of documents this through looking at other people's data and doing some narratives of local protest I've been following. This is being organized by local party organizations. The communists in some regions are quite active in organizing local protests. Sometimes local labor unions are organizing opposition organizations, and a lot of times just civic organizations. They address local issues. The most common is land use, abrogation of land use, urban planning, road building, delivery of services, those sorts of issues. Between 2005 and 2011, most of the protest happening was not in Moscow or St. Petersburg, where we saw 4 free elections break out. It was in the regional levels. After 2011, the exciting work by Jan Matti Dolbaum, a great young German scholar who's been part of this team who wrote the Navalny book, his other stream of research shows how after 2011-12, those resources came back into the regions and started changing and building ties in some conditions with political protests. So there was an exchange of activists, of information, of tools and tactics. And the protests went back to be organized at the regional and local level around these issues. We saw it burst onto the public scene in Shea, so the trash incinerator protests, where there's a lot of discussion. You saw it burst out in Kemerovo after the fire over the regulation of safety issues. And you saw it in Moscow around Moscow housing, which is a policy I'm following fairly closely. So there's been quite a bit of localized contestation around those things.
Our next question is from Professor Hans Klein at Georgia Tech. And he asks about, he says, Russian officials claim that Russia faces immediate external threat from NATO troops at its western border and warships in the Black Sea. Do such perceived foreign threats influence Russian elections?
So this is a perennial question, and they certainly do. And we know this from polling data, but those effects are much lower than we might think they are. So people who buy that narrative are a very small minority of Russian citizens. And the people who think, for example, similarly, that protests are funded by Hillary Clinton or run by the West are also quite small, even among people we found in our data in 2011, 2012 in the pro-Putin rally. But they are very important for sustaining at least part of this core support that is at the heart of the electoral manipulation that delivers elections.
So here's a question from our colleague Sarah Oates, professor and senior scholar at University of Maryland, and she just wants to ask whether this election was in any way fundamentally different from previous ones.
I think it was fundamentally different, and having looked at all these elections separately, each one is quite different. I think the first difference is the internet challenge and the complicity. And you already labeled that the Kremlin's victory. I would say that's the Kremlin's biggest victory out of this election. I think the second big difference is the effect of protest around Navalny's return and the shift in the regime of repression that followed those protests, which were clearly linked to waving off people from participating in protest after this fraudulent election. And so that not only the degree of repression changed, but the thing we don't often talk about is the tools of repression changed. So it became more like an Egyptian system of police showing up at night at your door saying you were recognized on the video or someone had informed, and personally threatening you and your family in close circle. So there's a new tool of repression, both in magnitude and in scope. And you don't have to have too many Moscow subway workers fired for having participated or having supported Navalny before people get very, very worried about their own personal stability, this personal stability I'm talking about. So I think that's a huge change. But I think, again, in the Putin era, the huge change is the defiance that we see and we'll be able to tease out as we get into the numbers. And I think often when we talk about opposition strategies or smart voting, they're either good or bad depending on whether or not there was a revolution. But here they clearly changed vote totals. And they clearly constrained the Kremlin's capacity to produce the outcome it wanted. And that in and of itself is an important national outcome.
Here's another question from Sarah Oates. Smart vote has gotten a lot of attention, but what does it really mean in the grand scheme of things for Russia and for online democratic movements and authoritarian regimes in general?
So without electronic voting, it means there's a tool that oppositions can engage in to challenge this incredible stranglehold that regimes have if they're able to do what Russia did and essentially curate ballots in order to produce a single outcome. And so, but again, that only happens when there are people on the ballot that could possibly win, and it acts as this strategic voting tool to coordinate around a candidate. Otherwise, it simply sends a message of discontent. So it's limited without a doubt, but I think we're underestimating its effect. And Mikhail Turchenko and Grigory Golosov at European University in St. Petersburg are doing this wonderful statistical analysis of the impact of smart voting. They did this work, it was published recently in Post-Soviet Affairs. And again, I think they'll pick it up in this election. Golosov was quite pessimistic in Riddle this morning about the limits of smart voting. I've heard other people be less pessimistic about the limits, even with electronic voting, but we'll have to see going forward how it works.
Okay, if you have any questions, I'm going to remind you and remind you of the way to communicate those questions. Yet again, you can do it by email at kennan@wilsoncenter.org, to our Twitter at Kennan Institute, or right on our Facebook page. So one of the things you talk about, especially in your book, is this notion of inter-election management, and that basically after each election, the Russians have ways and are trying to find mechanisms for the next election, so that every election is defensive, as it were, that they're reacting to the last election and not putting forward to a new platform. So to what extent is inter-election management kind of a ruse for the opposition? I mean, the opposition reveals itself in the intervening years. It reveals some of its strategies, so that by the time of the next election, really the Kremlin knows what their strategy is. So to what extent does inter-election management just allow the Kremlin to perceive their weaknesses and to make sure that when the election comes, they address those issues?
So it's a good point, and a case in point is after 2011, 2012, the Kremlin realizes it can't win PR national elections anymore, so it changes the election law, right? And it introduces the districts, where all the tools of electoral management enable the Kremlin to better control the districts. Remember, without the districts, there's no way they get a constitutional majority. And so the districts are hugely important to the system. But in 2016 elections, the Kremlin had sort of settled into a formula for managing those districts. And that formula was to have 5 or 6 candidates, to place the United Russia candidate somewhere in the middle of that space, to siphon off any opposition from the communists on the left, and to be able to manage. Now, in this round, because of the threat of smart voting, the Kremlin had to abandon that strategy. In many districts, they had 8 candidates running. And in some districts, there weren't enough shadow candidates to place into that grid or that strategy. And so they have these serial candidates where some candidates are running. Zhirinovsky ran in 10 constituencies in the last election because there weren't enough LDPR folks to run. And so I think that there's this constant challenge. So even if they are revealing and building from election to election, because smart voting is rooted all the way back into the Sobyanin Navalny 2013 mayoral election, where the idea starts to percolate from anything but united Russia to coordinating around a single candidate. They're still creating uncertainty. They created bars of uncertainty in this election. And I would say the uncertainty in this election was far higher than the Kremlin would have liked to do. And that the most dangerous thing an authoritarian regime can do is to jump in the level of repression. And it's been forced to do that. I think you're muted again, Will.
Yes.
We're out of practice.
We're out of practice, and there's feedback when I don't read move myself, so it's a problem. So the question is from Stephen Dietz from Babson College, and he's asked a question. So for the he was wondering if you found if some of the protesters are actually part of the United Russia movement, or are the protesters sincere in trying to oppose the opposition? I guess maybe to what extent does the United Russia is able even to co-opt some of the protesters as well?
So in my data from 2011-12, what we found was that the pro-Putin rally participants were very rarely members of any organization, including United Russia or the All-Union People's Front. Rather, they were mobilized from their workplace. That doesn't mean that they weren't supporters of Putin. They certainly were. But I think that it also means that their organizational ties and loyalties are quite limited. On the other side, there were a couple, I think there were 4 or 5 people in the data that said they were Putin supporters, but attended the anti-Putin protests. And we call this the girlfriend effect, right? Someone in your close circle dragged you to this thing, or you wanted to see what was going on. They were very much outliers in the data. So I don't think while certainly I think we know that the security services have deep infiltrated roots in all of these organizations and are observing, that kind of co-optation wasn't clear in the data.
Our next question comes from Mitchell Pullman, and he asked, what was the youth turnout like for the election?
So I wish I could tell you that I spent a lot of time trying to figure that out today. And I can only tell you that in terms of exit polling on the last day, there was a bump in youth turnout, and that it was higher than people expected given the rate, but we just don't know yet what those numbers look like, except for this exit polling, and I'm a little reluctant to rely on it right now.
And a follow-up question from Jans Alfeld. Are there signs of discussions among the younger members of United Russia about the succession question? Clearly, Putin doesn't want to talk about a succession question, but is anyone talking about it? Or do young people even think about it?
So some folks in Moscow this morning were putting out this idea that even the officials don't believe in the legitimacy of this election and are very worried about the succession question and also their own positions in the system. So I can imagine those discussions are going on. They're pretty hidden right now. We know that there are huge new cadres being trained by United Russia, but they haven't broken into the candidate cadres. There are the people running the candidate staff. There are the people creating these media ecologies where they're using United Russia money to plant stories in regional press or city press or urban press. So far, we haven't seen those guys break out onto the scene as I think some of us thought we might see happen in 2016 and going forward. It just hasn't happened. And in some ways, electronic voting that was tried out in the UR primary really tamped down the enthusiasm of those guys for even running. I'll jump the gun and say a more interesting schism and conversation is going to be happening within the Communist Party. So the young activist members of the Communist Party, particularly in the regions, but also in the center, are really trying to reshape the party into a sort of West European Social Democratic Party. There's always been resistance at the top. This schism has existed. Again, this is like the advantage of being old, right? This schism has existed since the mid-90s, and now it's back. And now it's not going to be hidden in the regions where some communists have been very active, including in places that are quite conservative, like Saratov, where Volodin won 70-something% of the vote and put a little video on Instagram about how much he loves his voters. There is also a very activist and very effective young communist campaigner who was arrested during the electoral process for intervening in observation processes, right? So that schism, that debate is going to move into the fore, I think.
A follow-up question from Professor Alfeld. With the recent hardening of the repression, is there anything that the West can do to support opposition within the country that does not backfire right away?
So I think there are several things that we can begin to do that are indirect. The first is we need new language to talk about these autocratic elections. We have to stop calling them democratic in any way. Even the word election is difficult. We have to stop saying there's competition because 10 people can win in a district. We need a new consistent way of communicating what the core problems of these elections are as a scholarly and analytic community. And that election can't be hamstrung by the fact that 30% of the population supports Putin, so there must be some democracy going on. There's not. And so that's the first thing. The second thing clearly is international internet governance and interference in elections needs to be on everybody's political agenda now. And that discussion has to happen vigorously, and it has to happen quite clearly across the different ways that interference occurs or does not occur across the platforms. Another thing that we might do that can't really harm things all that much right now is the diaspora community from Russia is politicized. In some ways, it's polarized. Some of you probably know that there were several buses from New York and Boston that brought the Russian community down to the Capitol on January 6th to protest with Trump. But there's also increasingly the potential for diaspora activism and the diaspora reaching into politics as the vanguard of the opposition is forced into exile. So I think, and since anyone who believes that the West is running the opposition, doing things like recognizing that these people are in political danger, giving them green cards and citizenship so they feel safe to pursue their international action is really important.
So we've talked about the inter-election management. What does Putin need to do so that in 2024 he learns his lessons, or learns the lessons that he thinks he needs to learn, and proceeds with his re-election campaign?
So let me say that I'm among the group of folks who think that maybe that decision hasn't been made yet, that it might not be Putin running, depending on how things develop. But I think that part of building constituency ties through United Russian patronage is one step to make the regime seem more effective. I wish we had a broader conversation about this, but I expect there'll be quite a bit of spending from the Sovereign Wealth Fund now in the lead up to elections, where we'll start to see the national government taking care of some national problems, offsetting some of this inflation, focusing on roads, focusing on urban development, focusing on transport and the ease of everyday life. Probably some wage increases for people dependent on state budgets. It's not clear that this will work. I think people are under the old stability rule said Putin will deliver stability. Putin's not delivering stability. Putin's delivering repression. Lots of problems that existed in 2000 exist today. Structural economic reform and opportunity cost of the state's kleptocratic system is evident. And it depends on whether or not this election starts to convince people that that really is the case. And that's why this information is so important, right? To shape what happens next. How many people are seeing the opportunity cost of keeping the regime in power?
So we have one last question from Johannes Alfeld, and he asked, has the recent crackdown on the opposition been influenced by events in Belarus over the past year? So to what extent is Putin learning from Mr. Lukashenko, and to what extent is he just following his actions?
Certainly there's a lesson about the level of repression that can be carried out without backlash or backfire, right? A huge re-escalation or remobilization. But I wouldn't carry that too far. Russia's not Belarus. I think Putin recognizes that, both in its resources of its population, but also the size of the country and the urban centers. So it's not exactly comparable. But I also think that the lesson of Belarus speaks to two constituencies in Russia that are active. And one really important lesson. The first lesson is that my data show that mobilization comes from a vanguard going out onto the streets and demonstrating the power of mobilizing. That is, protest is in itself mobilizing. And what Putin did was to arrest the vanguard, much in the way that Lukashenko has done, and take the vanguard out of practice. So there's no way to lead these protests. There is no vanguard to kick off the protest. And that's a really important point. And even the candidates in Smart Vote don't look like a protest vanguard. The second thing this speaks to among the population is there's a big portion of people, we saw this even in 2011-12, it's grown, that says literally don't poke the bear. That protest only leads to more repression. So yes, let's have change, let's keep fighting, let's make our lives better, let's act collectively, but protest isn't the way. And I think that coalition has grown stronger. And then I think maybe some of the tools of protest that were out there probably created some sort of demonstration, although I don't think this presidential administration needs Belarus to tell them how to repress.
Well, we're coming to the end of our discussion. Again, you can find Regina's book on Amazon and at the Cambridge University Press website. Regina, you said a lot already, and we've you with many questions, but any final thoughts that you want to just say here at the end?
I just want to say it's hard to be optimistic about what's happening in Russia, but it was inspiring to see the many acts of heroism and courage that were carried out across these elections. And I just want to urge people to take a longer view than simply looking at the outcome and look at the deeper implications of all of what has happened over the past 3 days, the past year, and going forward, the implications of how they won this election and how difficult it was for what comes next.
Thank you very much, Regina, and thank you all for listening. And we look forward to your participation in future Kennan Institute events. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Will.